house, as far as we know, on official record, it was built in 1796 by Ichabod Benton Miller, a young surveyor. We believe, because of the wording on the land warrant, it could have been built actually in 1795, which makes it, of course, 220 years old, thereabouts. Ichabod Benton Miller, the house, of course, is named for him. He was a young surveyor who came down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt. He met over in Columbia on the other side of the river in the Sims Purchase in Columbia, which was a settlement over on that side. He met a young lady named Sarah Mercer, and they got married. And he and his father-in-law bought the 600 acres that this log house now sits on from the heir of Captain Matthew Jewett, John Jewett, who didn't want to move here after the war after his father died. So young Ichabod, if I remember correctly, bought 400 acres or 441 for 50 cents an acre at $220, and his father-in-law bought the remaining balance of the 600 acres, and he had his son lay out a town called Mercersburg, which of course he had a station over where Jones Fish Hatchery is today. A station back in those days was basically a fortified log house surrounded by a stockade. And when the settlers would come, it was a safe place for them to stay until they could contract with a surveyor to find land, and that they would of course buy at that point.
I started coming out and doing the research, reading the information on the log house, and then I realized, well, my family didn't own the house at the time my father talked about who was born here. So I knew there was a family connection, but I didn't exactly know how until I did further study, and then I determined that it was in fact the grandparents of the people my father talked about who actually owned the house, lived here, and so forth. The previous gentleman had indicated that about the original owner, Ichabod Benton Miller, but he owned this house. He built this house again around 1796. Although there's some indication it could have been 1795. The township actually began in 1793. It might have been dangerous to live here before then. But anyway, he rented the house to one of my relatives, and that was James Noble and his wife Tabitha Pardue. The story on the Noble family is they came from North Carolina. They stopped in Kentucky for a couple years around Lexington, and then they moved to Bethel. They're in the 1820 census in Bethel, Ohio. And then we knew originally from records many years ago that they were here in the house by 1830 because they're in the Anderson Township census in 1830.
The house itself, if you had enough men, women, and horses, you could build a house like this pretty much in one day. But the rule of thumb was 4 men, 3 days to build a house like this. So when you wanted to build a house like this, obviously you had to determine a good place to put it. You wanted some running water. Over there's Clough Creek. Clough Creek is named after Richard Clough Anderson, the deputy surveyor of the Virginia Military District. Of course, the township is as well. But that would be your source of water, and also rock for the root cellar. So essentially you would identify the house floor plan with 4 large stones. You would dig out the root cellar, of course line the walls. We still have an earthen packed floor, as always been there. And then of course you would start marking the trees that you wanted to use for the building of this house. And before doing all that, you would put a word out within the community at church meetings and other social functions that you were going to build a house. You needed to hire 2 cornermen and as many helpers, of course, as you could get your hands on. So people would, of course, show up at some point in time, not all together, but let's just assume, for example, there were 4 men, 3 days. At the end of every day, these men were obviously fed. At the end of the building of the house, there was a big party. The cornermen were generally paid for their services. In those days, money wasn't so common in this part of the country because there was nowhere to spend the money. So it was generally agreed that it would either be bartered for services rendered back, or in other times they would pay them with corn. And when I say corn, I don't mean ears of corn or bags of grain. I mean liquid corn, distilled corn. Everybody nowadays seems to think that Kentucky, of course, is the only place where moonshine was made. Moonshine was fairly common throughout southern Ohio as well. We have the same limestone rock here and so forth. And farmers, for the most part, would always plant extra corn because you needed it to feed yourself. your livestock, and of course any leftovers you could distill it and use it as barter. It was common in those days for people to carry moonshine, white dog whiskey, whatever you want to call it. They found it just with experience that as they were traveling and crossing a stream and they wanted to get a drink of water, if they put a couple of drops of the moonshine in the water, it was a little more palatable to their system over the long run. But the house itself, the main part of the house is 1795. Right now, if you are looking at the house, the chinking that holds the logs together is actually cement. In 1990, we replaced some of the logs, replaced all the mud chinking with cement, just of course to last longer. But when the house was like this was built, after 3 days, essentially what you would have is a structure that looks something like this. And you would have to fill in those gaps. And I should back up and say the function of the corner men is they would cut the steeple notching that actually holds the structure together. Unlike the Lincoln logs that are perfectly machined in a factory that we all played with as kids, those hold themselves together. Steeple notching is designed to do pretty much the same thing, to hold the logs in place. That's why you hired the corner men. And then the mud chinking that you would grab clay from the creek and all fall from the steeple notching, hay, horsehair as binders, and you would cram in these gaps between the logs, and you would smooth it over, if you will, as you can see on the outside here. And then on the inside, you would then get a mixture of clay and build up successive layers of clay on the inside called daubing. And once you had a fairly flat surface on the inside of the wall, you would whitewash that, because the inside of the house, the only light you had in there when you closed the doors and the shutters or at nighttime was from candles or from the fire, of course, in the hearth. There was no glass available in this area until 1824, I believe, when a merchant in Moscow house started selling it. And if you look at our center window out front, the center top window, it's a very wavy piece of glass. We don't know that that's an original piece of glass, but it's a very old piece of glass.
We know that my family didn't buy the log house until 1836 because we have the deed for that purchase. And the interesting thing was that my grandfather, James Noble, must have already been deceased because it was his wife that purchased the home. We know they had a child in 1833, and she alone buys the house in 1836. So we assume that this man, James Noble, died between 1833 and 1836. So we found the deed. She purchased it from Ichabod Benton Miller. It was in 1936, and that it was very unusual for a woman to purchase property in 1836. I would have only assumed, like I said, that her husband was deceased. Now, where she got the money, how she could afford this, I have no idea. But she bought the house in 15 acres. So it was a nice chunk of land, and we also know that she had 10 children. So here she is having her husband died with a 1-year-old baby. Later we found that it was 1833 that James Noble died. So she has a baby, 10 children, and she buys this land in 1836 and lived here for a 30-year period. We know that she sold the land. It wasn't her. We assume she must have been deceased because all of her children sold the land in 1867. And we have that deed in the Hamilton County Courthouse. And the interesting thing about that deed, because she was deceased, it listed all of the children and their spouses, and if her children were deceased, it listed the grandchildren. So it was a great genealogical record of her family. So they lived here for 30 years. Like the previous gentleman, Charlie, said, the house was built around 1795, 1796. They added the middle section around 1840 or so, 1830, 1840. Well, that would have been the time that my people lived here. And of course, with 10 children, you can imagine they needed to expand the original log house and add this middle section. So they did that approximately that time frame, 1840 to 30 to 40. So it's nice to know that where the residents of my family lived, and I can walk in the house and go through the area and imagine that this was how they lived their life.